The sun did not shine on the Blackwood basin. It hammered. It beat down on the cracked white alkali earth until the horizon shimmered in a watery haze, twisting the jagged peaks of the distant ridges into dancing fluid teeth. Not a single cloud offered reprieve in the bleached dome of the sky. The air tasted of crushed rock and dried sage, thick and abrasive against the back of the throat. Heat radiated from the ground, invisible waves distorting the dry scrub brush and turning the vast, empty expanse into a sprawling kiln. On the porch of a weathered, sun-bleached cabin, Silas sat. The wood beneath his heavy leather boots was splintered and gray, groaning a low, hollow complaint whenever he shifted his weight. A heavy whetstone rested across his right thigh. In his thick, calloused hands, a steel hunting knife rhythmically met the stone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was the only pulse in a dead world. Sweat carved pale, uneven rivers through the fine layer of dust coating his neck, soaking deep into the frayed collar of a cotton shirt that had once been blue but was now the color of old ash. His hands, massive and scarred like weathered hickory bark, moved with mechanical, unhurried precision. He didn't look up at the vast emptiness spreading out before him. He didn't need to. The basin had a way of announcing its miseries long before they arrived. The wind shifted. It dropped the dry scent of brittle weed and carried something else across the flatlands. Copper, sour sweat, exhaustion. Silas stopped the blade mid-stroke. He lifted his head slowly, beneath the frayed brim of his battered Stetson. His eyes, the flat, unforgiving color of rusted iron, narrowed against the brutal glare. Out there, where the wagon trail vanished into the shimmering heat, waves a dark smudge detached itself from the distortion of the horizon. It was moving impossibly slow. He set the knife down on a warped wooden barrel beside his chair. He did not stand. He simply rested his thick forearms on his knees, his posture entirely relaxed, but coiled tight like a snake digesting the heat of a flat rock. Minutes bled away into the stifling afternoon. The smudge slowly gained shape, hardening into the distinct silhouette of a rider. It was a mare, once a heavy-set roan, now reduced to a walking scaffolding of bone. Her head hung violently low, her soft nose nearly dragging in the jagged rocks of the trail. Each step was a labored, agonizing negotiation with gravity. Her hooves didn't clock against the hardpan. They shuffled, kicking up weak, pathetic puffs of white dust that hung in the still air behind her. But it wasn't the dying animal that kept Silas's gaze fixed. It was the cargo draped across her back. Two figures slouched heavily over the animal's withers, merging into a single exhausted lump. As they drew closer, the brutal light carved out their details. A girl clutched the frayed leather reins. Her clothes were oversized, practically swallowing her thin frame caked in layers of dried mud, and something far darker and stiffer near the hem of her coat. Slumped heavily against her narrow chest was a smaller shape, a boy. His head lolled loosely with the mare's uneven, staggering gait, a ragged linen cap pulled low, obscuring his face. The mare stopped 20 yards from the edge of the porch. She didn't choose to stop. Her front knees simply locked, refusing the command to take another step. She let out a hollow, rattling exhale that vibrated through her exposed ribs and kicked up a small cloud of dust beneath her nostrils. Her flanks heaved with frantic, shallow tremors. Silas remained entirely still in the shadows of the porch roof. Only the hot wind moved, lifting a loose, curled shingle on the cabin roof above his head. Clack, clack. The girl swung her right leg over the high saddle horn. She slipped down her worn boots, hitting the packed earth with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Her knees buckled deeply for a fraction of a second, sending her toward the dirt, but she caught herself, her fingers digging fiercely into the stiff stirrup leather. Her knuckles turned bone white beneath the grime. She reached up, wrapping her thin, trembling arms around the boy's waist, and dragged his dead weight down from the saddle. He slid against her entirely limp, the toes of his boots dragging a trail in the dust. She supported his weight against her hip, her narrow chest heaving, and turned her face toward the porch. Her lips were violently cracked, split deep in the center, and heavily crusted with dried blood. Her left cheekbone bore a dark, swelling plum of a bruise, the edges yellowing and turning green under the layer of trail dirt. But her eyes were sharp. They were wide, feral, and completely stripped of everything but raw, agonizing survival. She took a step forward, dragging the boy, then another. The 20 yards of distance between the dying mare and the wooden steps of the porch seemed to stretch into an ocean of blistering heat. Silas watched the boy's boots carve 2 parallel lines in the alkali dust. The kid wasn't moving on his own. His shallow, rapid breaths barely lifted the thin, filthy fabric of his oversized shirt. 10 yards. 5 yards. She stopped at the bottom of the 3 wooden steps. The shade of the porch roof stopped an inch from the toes of her boots. She stood in the full violence of the sun, looking up at the broad, shadowed figure of the man sitting above her. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Silas met her stare. He offered no greeting. He made no motion to help. His face was a mask of weathered leather, his jaw set hard, utterly unreadable. The girl swallowed hard. The muscles in her thin throat worked painfully against the absolute dryness. She shifted the boy's dead weight, tightening her grip around his ribs, pulling him closer to her body, as if attempting to shield him from the heavy iron gaze of the man on the porch. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the high pitch of youth. It was gravel and scraped bone, stripped bare by extreme dehydration and miles of swallowed dust. "Please." The single word hung in the stifling air, brittle and fragile. Silas didn't blink. He just waited, his breathing slow and even. She drew in a ragged, whistling breath, her chest expanding against her filthy coat. Her grip on her brother grew fiercely tight. "My little brother is hungry. I can work." She didn't beg for charity. She didn't collapse into a fit of weeping. She stated a blunt fact and offered a trade, the sheer audacity of it, standing on the absolute ragged edge of physical collapse, bargaining with the very last ounce of air in her ruined lungs, resonated with a faint metallic ring in the deep, heavy quiet of the basin. Silas looked at her. He mapped the details in silence. He saw the awkward way she shifted her weight entirely to her left leg, heavily favoring the right. He saw the dark, ugly bruising wrapped around her thin wrists, the unmistakable crisscrossing pattern of deep rope burns. He saw the frantic, erratic pulse beating hard against the translucent skin of her throat. Without moving his head, he shifted his gaze past her, locking onto the trembling horse. The animal's flanks were coated in a thick, foamy lather of dried sweat. On its left hindquarter, stamped deep and dark into the hide, was a fresh brand. A perfect circle with a jagged line cutting violently through the center. The Broken Circle, a cattle outfit 3 days' hard ride south, run by men who measured their wealth in violence and never let things go easily. Trouble hadn't just knocked on his door. It had dragged itself across the desert and collapsed bleeding on his front steps. Silas looked back down at the girl. Her feral eyes were locked directly onto his, refusing to waver, refusing to look away, even as her exhausted body swayed dangerously in the blinding heat. The boy slouched against her chest, let out a low, wet whimper, a sound so small it was almost entirely swallowed by the dry wind. Silas slowly reached down and picked up an oily rag from the top of the barrel. He wiped the residual metal dust from the blade of his hunting knife, his movements deliberate, unhurried, agonizingly slow. He slid the heavy blade into the thick leather sheath resting at his hip. The sharp snap of the metal fastener echoed like a gunshot in the quiet air. He stood up. He was a massive structure of a man, broad-shouldered and imposing, casting a long, dark shadow that swept down the steps and finally blanketed the girl and her brother in brief, cool relief. He stepped to the very edge of the porch, looking down at them. The punishing heat radiating up from the ground met the absolute coldness of his stare. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He turned his head slightly to the left, spitting a thick, dark stream of tobacco juice into the dust near the base of the wooden stairs. He looked toward the open doorway of the cabin, an abyss of cool, dark shadows, then slowly looked back at the girl's defiant, broken face. He gave a single curt nod toward the open door. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He turned his broad back on the blinding sun, his boots thudding heavy against the floorboards, and walked inside. The cabin interior swallowed the glaring daylight, replacing the blinding white heat of the basin with a heavy, dust-moted twilight. The air inside held the trapped, stagnant memory of old wood smoke, dried leather, and strong, stale coffee. It was 10 degrees cooler than the porch, but the atmosphere felt thicker, pressing down on the shoulders like a physical weight. Silas left the door standing wide open. The rectangular slab of brilliant sunlight cut across the scuffed floorboards, illuminating the dancing particles of dust kicked up by his boots. He did not look back to see if the girl had followed. He walked straight to the small cast-iron stove squatting in the far corner of the room. A heavy, dragging scrape echoed from the threshold. The girl breached the doorway. She hauled the boy over the raised wooden lip of the frame, her boots scuffing clumsily against the grain. She leaned heavily against the jamb for a fraction of a second, her breath pulling in ragged, shallow gasps. Her eyes, adjusting poorly to the sudden gloom, darted around the confined space, cataloging the exits, the shadows, the rack of Winchester rifles locked behind a glass-fronted cabinet on the far wall. She moved like a cornered animal forced into a cage, dragging her brother toward a heavy oak table in the center of the room. She deposited him onto a solid wooden chair. The boy slumped forward instantly, his cheek coming to rest against the scarred tabletop. His eyes remained shut. Silas paid them no outward attention. He struck a lucifer match against the rusted iron flank of the stove. The sharp, abrasive scratch tore through the quiet. A flare of yellow sulfur snapped into existence, illuminating the deep creases around his eyes. He tossed the match into the firebox, threw in a handful of dry mesquite twigs, and closed the heavy iron door with a dull, metallic clank. He moved to a makeshift pantry shelf. He retrieved a thick, salt-cured slab of pork, wrapped in oiled paper, a tin canister of dried pinto beans, and a half-loaf of dense sourdough bread, hard as a cobblestone. He set a scarred wooden cutting board on the counter next to the stove. He drew his hunting knife. The blade slid through the tough rind of the salt pork with a wet, heavy parting sound. He cut 3 thick slices. The fat was dense and white, the meat a deep, cured red. He dropped the slices into a cold iron skillet and shoved it directly over the center eye of the stove. Silence reclaimed the room, broken only by the low, tentative crackle of the mesquite catching fire. The girl stood rigid beside her brother's chair. Her hands hovered awkwardly near her sides, fingers twitching, curling inward toward her palms. She watched Silas's broad back. She watched the movement of his shoulders beneath the ash-colored shirt. The iron skillet began to heat. A low hiss started building slowly into an angry popping spit as the white fat began to render and melt down into translucent grease. The heavy, savory smoke of frying salt pork plumed upward, hitting the low ceiling and rolling outward across the room. It reached the table. The girl's posture snapped tight. Her nostrils flared. Her throat worked convulsively, an involuntary swallow against an empty, parched stomach. The boy on the table stirred. His eyelids fluttered, parting just enough to reveal the dull, feverish whites of his eyes. He let out a low, breathy moan, his nose turning instinctively toward the stove. Silas opened the tin canister. He dumped 2 heavy scoops of pre-soaked beans into a smaller pot, added a splash of water from a ceramic jug, and set it next to the spitting pork. He took the hard sourdough loaf and, pressing the flat of his palm against the top crust, sliced through it with heavy downward thrusts of his knife. He plated the food. He used a long iron fork to fish the curling browned edges of the salt pork from the grease, laying them onto 2 battered tin plates. He spooned the hot beans beside the meat. He dropped a thick slice of the hard bread onto each plate to soak up the residual fat. He picked up both plates, turning away from the heat of the stove. He walked to the oak table. He set one plate directly in front of the slumped boy. He set the other at the edge of the table closest to the girl. He didn't push them toward her. He simply set them down and stepped back. He walked over to a tin bucket resting on a low bench near the door. He picked up a long-handled metal dipper, submerging it into the cool well water, and brought it back to the table. He set the dripping dipper down beside the girl's plate. Then Silas pulled out a chair on the opposite side of the table. The wood groaned under his weight as he sat down. He reached for a chipped enamel mug resting near the center, picked up a blackened tin coffee pot from the table's edge, and poured a stream of thick, lukewarm, sludge-black coffee. He leaned back in his chair, resting his forearms on the table. He wrapped his large hands around the mug and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was bitter, tasting of burnt earth and rusted iron. He lowered the mug. He looked at the girl. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were locked onto the steaming tin plate, tracking the thin ribbons of heat rising from the beans. A visible tremor started in her knees and vibrated all the way up to her shoulders. Her jaw clenched tight, her cracked lips pressing together until a fresh drop of blood welled up from the split in the center. She reached for the water first. Her hand shot out, snatching the metal dipper with a desperate, jerky motion. She brought it to her brother's lips. She lifted his head with her free hand, tilting the metal rim against his mouth. "Drink," she commanded. Her voice was a dry croak. The boy swallowed blindly. The water spilled over his chin, cutting clean tracks through the thick layer of trail dust coating his neck, soaking into the collar of his ruined shirt. He coughed a weak rattling sound, but he drank. When he turned his head away, the girl brought the dipper to her own mouth. She didn't sip. She threw her head back and drained the remaining water in 2 massive, violent gulps. She dropped the metal dipper onto the table. It landed with a loud, hollow clatter. She reached for the plate. She didn't use the tin spoon resting beside the beans. She used her fingers. She grabbed a piece of the hot, grease-soaked salt pork and shoved it past her split lips. She didn't chew. She swallowed it nearly whole. She grabbed the hard bread, tearing off a massive chunk, and forced it into her mouth, her jaw working furiously, mechanically. She ate like a starved wolf tearing into a fresh carcass, hunched over the plate. Her left arm curled protectively around her brother's chair, her eyes darting constantly from the plate to Silas and back again. Silas sat perfectly still. He let the quiet tick away. He watched her over the rim of his mug. He observed the mechanical, frantic way she chewed. He saw the dark dirt caked deep beneath her fingernails, the skin around her cuticles torn and bleeding. He looked at the heavy purple bruising masking her left cheekbone. The swelling had entirely shut her left eye, turning the surrounding flesh into a tight, glossy plum color. That wasn't a mark from a fall. That was the unmistakable geometry of a closed fist delivered by a grown man. His gaze dropped lower. As she reached for another handful of beans, the oversized sleeve of her coat slid back, exposing her forearm. The skin was scraped raw. Thick, overlapping bands of deep red and angry purple circled her wrists. The skin was broken in several places, weeping clear fluid and starting to scab over with dirt. Rope burns. Heavy, coarse hemp rope pulled tight enough to cut off circulation, secured by someone who intended to hold her against her will. Silas shifted his flat iron eyes to the boy. The kid had finally managed to pick up his slice of bread. His hands trembled so violently he could barely bring the food to his mouth. The collar of his shirt hung loose. Through the gap in the fabric, Silas saw a long, raised welt slashing diagonally across the boy's pale collarbone, the angry red line terminating somewhere beneath the fabric covering his chest. A whip mark, or a heavy leather riding crop. They were running. The brand on the dying horse outside told him who owned the animal. The marks on their bodies told him what they were running from. The girl choked. She had shoved too much of the dry sourdough into her mouth at once. Her chest hitched violently. She pounded her fist against her sternum, coughing out a dry spray of crumbs onto the table, her eyes watering in panic. Silas set his enamel mug down on the wood. The heavy thud stopped her coughing fit. She froze her chest, heaving, staring at him with wide animal caution. Silas looked at the half-empty plate, then met her feral stare. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried across the table. "Chew slow." He picked up his mug again. "You'll heave it all back up." The Blackwood basin did not merely lose the sun. It expelled it. The brutal, blinding white of the afternoon bled out into a bruised, violent purple along the jagged western ridges before the sky finally hardened into a deep, star-choked black. With the absence of the sun came the immediate punishing theft of heat. The desert surrendered its warmth with a rapid, shivering exhale. The air, which only hours ago had tasted of baking dust and fire, turned brittle and sharp. It blew off the high plateaus, carrying the distinct metallic bite of deep frost, cutting through the sparse sagebrush with a low, whistling hiss. Silas sat in the dense shadow of the porch awning. He had traded his ash-colored cotton shirt for a heavy, ankle-length canvas duster. The collar was turned up high against the nape of his neck. His boots rested flat on the porch, railing his posture utterly still. His thick fingers moved methodically in the dark, pinching a precise measure of loose tobacco from a leather pouch, spreading it along the crease of a thin white paper. He rolled the cylinder with the practiced, unthinking muscle memory of decades, sealing the edge with a quick swipe of his tongue. He struck a lucifer match against the underside of his boot. The sudden violent flare of yellow sulfur ruptured the absolute darkness. The light carved deep, harsh shadows into the weathered topography of his face, illuminating the flat, dead iron of his eyes. He brought the flame to the tip of the paper. He drew in a slow, heavy breath. The cherry glowed a fierce, angry orange, reflecting briefly in his pupils. He shook the match out. The darkness swallowed the porch once again, leaving only the floating, pulsing ember of the cigarette. The cold began its slow, creeping work. It bypassed the heavy canvas of the duster, sinking directly into the muscle and bone of his left shoulder. Beneath his shirt, a thick, star-shaped knot of puckered scar tissue woke up. It throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, perfectly syncing with the heavy, slow beat of his heart. It always flared when the temperature plummeted. With the physical ache came the sensory ghosts. Silas stared out into the vast, ink-black void of the basin, but he did not see the desert. He drew the harsh, biting smoke deep into his lungs, but he did not smell burning tobacco. He smelled scorched pine. He smelled the unmistakable heavy copper scent of blood pooling rapidly on a hardwood floor. He heard the deafening, confined roar of a heavy-caliber revolver discharging in a narrow hallway. He felt the sickening, weightless sensation of a hand slipping violently out of his grip. A small hand, growing cold against his palm. Silas's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck bunched tight, straining against his collar. He took another massive drag of the cigarette, pulling the burning smoke down until it seared his throat, letting the immediate physical sting scrub the phantom copper taste from his mouth. He exhaled a long, dense plume of gray smoke into the freezing air, his eyes narrowing to slits. A sound broke the wind. It was faint at first. A rhythmic, agonizing scrape. Wood dragging against frozen hardpan. Silas turned his head slightly. The moon hung low and bloated over the eastern ridge, a harsh white coin casting long, razor-sharp shadows across the yard. Out near the perimeter of the scrub line, a small, dark silhouette was moving. It was the girl. She had surrendered her heavy, oversized coat. Through the glassless window of the cabin, Silas could see the boy curled tightly on Silas's own cot, thoroughly cocooned in the thick fabric. The girl wore only a threadbare muslin shirt, the material so thin it was practically translucent in the moonlight. The freezing wind whipped the loose fabric violently against her ribs. She was hauling a massive twisted limb of dead ironwood. The deadfall was easily half her body weight, a gnarled, heavy mass of dense desert timber. She had both hands wrapped fiercely around a protruding branch. Her narrow back arched as she leaned her entire meager weight forward. Her boots slipped on the frost-heaved gravel. Her right knee, heavily favored, finally buckled. She went down hard, her shin striking a half-buried stone with a dull thud. The ironwood clattered loudly onto the freezing dirt. Silas watched the glowing tip of his cigarette burn down toward his knuckles. He watched the small figure in the dirt. She didn't stay down. She didn't curl into a ball to preserve her body heat. Her breathing plumed in ragged, rapid white clouds in the moonlight. She scrambled back to her feet, her movements jerky and desperate, her bare hands. The knuckles bruised and split from the day's ride clamped back down onto the rough, splintered bark of the ironwood. She dug her boot heels into the dirt and pulled again. She dragged the heavy limb yard by grueling yard across the open space, pulling it all the way to the side of the cabin. She hoisted one end, her narrow shoulders trembling violently under the strain, and heaved it atop Silas's neatly stacked cord of firewood. She stood there for a fraction of a second, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her hands tucking into her armpits as a violent, uncontrollable shiver racked her entire frame. The cold was turning the pale skin of her arms a mottled, bruised blue. She turned away from the woodpile. She didn't head for the open door of the cabin and the residual warmth of the iron stove. She turned toward the corral. The dying mare stood locked in the far corner, head drooping to its knees, a dark, motionless statue against the frost. The girl walked to the weathered wooden fence. She reached up with trembling fingers and unhooked a stiff, bristled curry comb dangling from a leather strap on the gatepost. She squeezed between the rails and approached the ruined animal. She began to drag the heavy comb over the mare's matted, lather-crusted flank. The motion was purely mechanical, completely drained of kinetic force. The comb caught on tangles of dried sweat and dirt, and the girl forced it through her arm, moving in a repetitive, exhausted rhythm. The horse didn't twitch. It didn't acknowledge her presence. It was merely waiting for the cold to finish the job the journey had started. Silas sat in the shadows, listening to the dry, scraping rhythm of the comb echoing across the freezing yard. She was working herself into the dirt. She was literally freezing to death to fulfill a verbal contract he had never agreed to prove her worth, to buy one night of safety for the boy sleeping inside. Silas pinched the burning cherry of his cigarette between his thumb and forefinger. The ember died instantly, biting briefly into his calloused skin. He tossed the dead paper over the railing. He stood up. The wooden floorboards of the porch groaned a loud, hollow complaint under his immense weight. He stepped off the porch. The heavy thud of his leather boots against the frozen gravel was distinct, deliberate, and entirely unmasked. The sound carried sharply across the quiet yard. Inside the corral, the girl's shoulders instantly seized, hiking violently up toward her ears. The rhythm of her brushing grew frantic. The curry comb scraped harshly, loudly against the mare's protruding hip bone. Her elbows locked tight. She didn't turn around. She didn't look back. She just stared blankly at the horse's ribs, brushing harder, faster, her breath whistling sharply through her nose. Silas reached the corral fence. He didn't bother squeezing between the rails. He simply stepped over the middle bar, his heavy coat sweeping against the wood. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He stopped an arm's length behind her thin, shivering back. He reached out. His massive right hand, warm and rough as cured saddle leather, closed entirely over her trembling, frozen fingers and the wooden block of the curry comb. The frantic, desperate motion stopped dead. The silence of the basin flooded instantly back into the corral, completely total, save for the rapid, terrified hitching of her breath. Silas didn't pull her hand away from the horse. He didn't apply any pressure. He just held her locked in place, the sheer size and heat of his hand completely engulfing hers. He looked down at the crown of her head. "Horse is dead by morning," he stated. His voice was a low, flat rumble that vibrated through the freezing air, devoid of anger, devoid of pity. He released his grip on her hand. He took a single step back, giving her space. "Woodpile is full." He looked toward the open, dark doorway of the cabin. He looked back at her thin, rigid spine. "Go inside." Dawn did not break over the basin. It seeped in. It bled a pale, anemic gray across the jagged eastern ridges, slowly dissolving the ink-black sky into a bruised, washed-out slate. The biting frost of the night clung stubbornly to the scrub brush, turning the brittle branches into jagged teeth of white ice. The wind had died completely. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on the cracked earth. Inside the cabin, the cast-iron stove radiated a low, steady heat. A dented tin pot sat over the coals, the dark liquid inside beginning to roll and spit, sending the harsh, bitter scent of boiling chicory and roasted beans into the stagnant air. Silas stood by the open window. He had not slept. His heavy canvas duster hung perfectly still around his broad shoulders. He held a chipped enamel mug in his right hand, the rising steam curling into his weathered face. His eyes, the color of old flint, were locked on the southern horizon. The world was motionless, but the horizon was not. A thin, dirty ribbon of ochre dust hung suspended against the pale sky. It was miles out past the dry wash and the twisting canyons, but it was there. It did not swirl or dissipate like a desert devil born of wind. It moved with deliberate driving purpose, a continuous churning line cutting a straight path through the sage. Silas took a slow drag from his mug. The coffee scorched the back of his throat. He lowered the tin cup, resting it on the wooden sill. He turned his head. The girl was awake. She sat rigidly on the edge of the narrow cot, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The oversized coat was draped heavily over her sleeping brother. Her bruised left eye was fully swollen shut now, a tight, glossy knot of black and purple flesh. Her good eye tracked Silas's every microscopic movement. She had heard the subtle shift in his breathing. She had seen the imperceptible tightening of his jaw. She looked toward the open window, tracing his line of sight. She saw the dust. Her throat worked convulsively. The thin fabric of her muslin shirt vibrated over her heart. She didn't make a sound, but her hands moved instinctively, pulling the heavy coat tighter around the boy's shoulders. Silas stepped away from the window. His boots landed heavy and deliberate on the scuffed floorboards. He walked to the center of the room, stopping directly over a faded, moth-eaten Navajo rug. He kicked the edge of the heavy wool aside. Beneath the rug, flush with the floorboards, sat a recessed iron ring. Silas hooked his thick thumb through the rusted metal and pulled upward. The hidden trapdoor yielded with a deep, agonizing groan of neglected wood and swelling hinges. A square of pitch-black darkness yawned open in the floor. A wave of cold, stagnant air rolled up into the cabin, carrying the dense, earthy odor of damp clay, dry rot, and old root vegetables. Silas looked at the girl. He pointed a thick, calloused finger down into the black square. "Take him!" The command was a low, gravelly vibration in his chest. The girl didn't hesitate. She scrambled off the cot, her bare feet slapping quietly against the wood. She hooked her arms under her brother's armpits, dragging his limp, feverish weight off the mattress. The boy whimpered a dry, rattling sound in his chest, his head lolling against her collarbone. She hauled him to the edge of the opening. A narrow set of rough-hewn wooden stairs descended into the gloom. She navigated the first step backward, supporting his entire weight against her narrow frame, her toes gripping the splintered wood. She descended slowly, swallowed inch by the damp earth. Silas walked to a small wooden shelf near the stove. He picked up a cold kerosene lantern and a small box of lucifer matches. He carried them to the edge of the hole. The girl was standing at the bottom of the stairs, a pale, shivering ghost in the shadows. She had propped the boy against a wall of packed dirt. Silas knelt on one knee. He handed the cold lantern down to her. She reached up, her trembling fingers brushing the scarred leather of his palm as she took the wire handle. He dropped the box of matches into her open palm. "Do not light it unless you hear me open this door." He leaned forward slightly, his massive shoulders blocking out the pale morning light from the window above. "Do not come up. Do not make a sound." She stared up at him. Her chest heaved. She gave a single, rigid nod. Silas stood. He grasped the heavy iron ring and lowered the thick oak door. The wood settled into its frame with a solid, resonant thud, sealing the damp cold below. He dragged the heavy Navajo rug back over the seam, smoothing the frayed edges with the side of his boot. He walked to the far wall. A tall, glass-fronted cabinet stood bolted to the timber. Silas reached into the pocket of his duster, producing a small brass key. The lock turned with a sharp, metallic click. He swung the glass door open. The smell of the cabinet rolled out, a sharp, mechanical blend of polished walnut, cold-blued steel, and the distinct, pungent bite of gun grease. He reached past a double-barreled scattergun and closed his massive hand around the neck of a Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. He pulled it from the rack. The weapon was immaculate. The brass receiver caught the weak morning light, glowing with a dull, heavy luster. The octagonal barrel was long, heavy, and completely devoid of rust. He carried the rifle to the heavy oak table. He opened a small leather pouch resting near the salt jar. He spilled a handful of heavy, blunt-nosed .44-40 cartridges onto the wood. The brass cylinders rolled heavily, clinking against each other. Silas picked up the first cartridge. He pressed the brass rim against the spring-loaded loading gate on the side of the receiver. He pushed it forward. Snick. The heavy metal slid into the magazine tube. The sound was sharp, precise, and violently loud in the quiet cabin. He picked up another. Snick. He fed the weapon with a slow, mechanical rhythm. Each push of his thumb was deliberate. He didn't rush. He filled the tube until the internal spring groaned against the pressure of the brass. He picked up the rifle. He gripped the lever, dropping it forward and racking it back in one fluid, violent motion. Clack, clack. A brass cartridge was stripped from the tube and shoved perfectly into the firing chamber. He carefully lowered the hammer with his thumb resting it at the half-cock notch. He walked back to the open doorway. The sun had finally crested the eastern ridge. It threw a long, blinding spear of pale light across the basin floor, illuminating the swirling dust in the yard. The ribbon of ochre on the southern horizon had thickened. It was no longer a smudge. It was a dense, billowing cloud. Beneath the churning dust, the rhythmic, heavy vibration of galloping hooves began to bleed into the earth. It started as a low tremor, a faint pulse against the soles of Silas's boots, traveling up through the wooden floorboards of the porch. He stepped out onto the threshold. The freezing morning air hit the heavy canvas of his coat. He rested the butt of the Winchester against his right hip, the long octagonal barrel pointing down at the frost-covered gravel. He pulled a fresh paper from his pocket, pinched a measure of tobacco, and rolled it with his left hand. He struck a match against the doorframe, touched the flame to the tip, and drew the harsh smoke deep into his lungs. He exhaled a thick gray cloud into the crisp air. He stood on the porch, a massive, unmoving pillar of scarred muscle and canvas, and waited for the riders to arrive. The low vibration in the earth hardened into a distinct rhythmic drumming. The sound rolled across the flatlands, a heavy acoustic pressure pushing against the cold morning air. Silas did not shift his weight. He stood rooted to the porch, his right thumb resting light and cold against the serrated hammer of the Winchester. The dust cloud breached the perimeter of the yard. It rolled over the frost-heaved gravel, catching the pale, slanted rays of the early sun, turning the air into a hazy, shimmering curtain of crushed quartz and dry earth. From the center of the cloud, 3 shapes materialized. They rode shoulder to shoulder, a unified wall of moving muscle and leather. They brought their mounts to a halt exactly 10 yards from the edge of the porch. The transition from motion to stillness was abrupt, violent in its suddenness. The dust washed over them a fine, choking powder that settled heavily onto the brims of their hats and the shoulders of their canvas coats. The horses were hard-ridden, pushed miles past their limits. Their deep chests heaved in violent, jerky spasms. Thick ropes of white foam lathered their necks, dripping onto the frozen dirt with heavy, wet splatters. The animals blew hard through flared nostrils, the hot vapor of their breath, pluming into the freezing air in rhythmic clouds, mingling with the dissipating desert dust. The men sitting in the saddles matched their mounts. They bore the distinct weathered geometry of men who lived exclusively under the crushing weight of the open sky, their faces scoured by sand and hardened by brutal consequence. The rider on the left sat atop a restless, raw-boned bay. He was young, his jawline devoid of deep creases, but his eyes carried the nervous, erratic energy of a cornered coyote. His right hand rested casually, yet dangerously close to the worn wooden grip of a Colt revolver slung low and tied down against his thigh. He chewed rhythmically on the inside of his cheek, his jaw muscles flexing. The rider on the right was a massive, formless bulk wrapped entirely in a filthy buffalo hide coat. A heavy, double-barreled shotgun rested horizontally across his high saddle horn, his thick, leather-gloved hands gripping the worn stock with a casual permanence. He sat utterly motionless, his face buried deep within the shadow of a slouch hat, presenting only the bristling end of a wiry beard. But it was the man in the center who anchored the space. He rode a tall black gelding. He sat perfectly upright, his posture rigid and unyielding. A gray, dust-caked duster fell over his boots, hiding his stirrups. Beneath the shadow of a flat-brimmed Stetson, a jagged white scar tracked diagonally across the bridge of his nose, disappearing into the thick, tangled brush of a salt-and-pepper beard. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of winter ice. The silence settled over the yard. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, far denser than the morning frost. The only sounds were the creaking of saddle leather as the horses shifted their weight, the harsh, wet breathing of the animals, and the rhythmic metallic clinking of a curb bit as the black gelding chewed its iron. Silas took a slow drag from his cigarette. The tip flared a dull, angry orange. He let the smoke curl out of his nostrils, his flat iron gaze fixed dead center on the man with the scarred nose. He did not offer a greeting. He did not invite them to step down and share the warmth of a fire. The man on the black gelding leaned forward slightly, resting his heavy forearms against the leather of his saddle horn. He surveyed the weathered cabin, the empty yard, the stacked woodpile, and finally the massive, unmoving figure standing on the porch. "Cold morning to be standing watch?" The voice was a dry, grating rasp, like two coarse stones grinding against each other. It carried over the 10 yards, without the need for volume. Silas kept his thumb on the hammer. He let a full 5 seconds bleed away into the wind. "Porch is mine. Air is free." The words were a low, resonant rumble originating deep in his chest, flat and completely devoid of hospitality. The scarred man's lips twitched a microscopic upward pull that did not reach his pale eyes. He lifted his right hand, a slow, deliberate motion, and brushed a thick layer of white alkali dust from the sleeve of his duster. "Riding out of the basin, looking for a stray." He dropped his hand back to the saddle horn. He held Silas's gaze, leaning slightly harder into the pommel. "2 strays, actually. 2-legged variety." The young rider on the left shifted his weight in the saddle. The dry leather creaked sharply. His horse tossed its head, fighting the heavy bit, its hooves dancing a brief, restless tattoo on the gravel. The young man's fingers twitched a nervous tremor near the grip of his colt. The rising sun caught his face. Despite the biting cold of the morning air, a single heavy bead of sweat breached the hairline at his temple. It carved a clean, dark track through the caked dust on his cheek, hanging for a fraction of a second at his jawline, before dropping silently onto the collar of his coat. Silas tracked the drop of sweat. He tracked the twitching fingers. He looked back at the man in the center. "Lot of open country out there. Easy to lose things." The scarred man nodded slowly. The motion was an acknowledgement, not an agreement. True enough. But these two had a habit of taking things that didn't belong to them. Took a horse, a heavy roan. Bears the broken circle mark. The man paused. The air between them thickened. The atmospheric pressure dropped rapidly, a physical pressing weight pushing against the eardrums. The metallic clink of the horse bit sounded deafeningly loud. "Outfit like ours." The scarred man continued his voice, dropping an octave, settling into a dark, threatening register. "We don't take kindly to loss. We track our property. We retrieve our property." He tilted his head a fraction of an inch to the right. His pale eyes detached from Silas and began to scan the perimeter of the cabin, tracing the line of the woodpile sweeping slowly across the barren, frost-covered yard. His gaze hit the corral. The dying mare had finally collapsed. She lay entirely on her side in the frozen dirt, a heavy, motionless mound of prominent bone and lathered hide. Her hindquarter was exposed to the harsh morning light. The fresh, jagged brand, a perfect circle with a violent line cutting through the center, stood out dark and distinct against the pale, dusty coat. The silence in the yard crystallized. It turned brittle, absolute, ready to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The scarred man stared at the dead animal for a long time. He didn't blink. The rhythmic chewing of his gelding's bit stopped dead. The young rider on the left froze his hand, dropping the last inch, hovering directly over his iron. The massive man on the right tightened his grip on the double-barreled shotgun, his thick fingers curling firmly around the dual triggers beneath the heavy leather gloves. The scarred man slowly turned his head back to the porch. The microscopic smirk was entirely gone. His face was a mask of cold, calculated intent. The pale eyes were flat and dead. "Seems you found our stray." Silas brought the cigarette to his lips one last time. He pulled the remaining life from the paper, inhaling the harsh, burning tobacco deep into his lungs. He dropped the short, glowing stub onto the wooden floorboards of the porch. He didn't break eye contact with the man on the black horse. He brought the heavy heel of his leather boot down, grinding the ember into the splintered wood with a deliberate crushing twist of his ankle. A tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the sole of his boot. "Found a dead animal," Silas stated, his voice a flat, dead calm. "Nothing else." The scarred man straightened his spine. He pulled his shoulders back, expanding his broad chest under the heavy duster. The air in the yard turned entirely static. The invisible fuse had just burned down to the final grain of powder. "You calling me a liar, old man?" Silas tightened his grip on the lever of the Winchester. He let the heavy octagonal barrel drift down, no longer pointing at the dirt. The brass bead of the front sight came to rest dead center on the scarred man's chest. "I'm calling you a trespasser." Silas's thumb pulled back. The hammer locked into place with a sharp, heavy double click. "And you got 10 seconds to turn those animals around." The count never reached 10. It did not even reach 3. The young rider on the left snapped. The unbearable pressure of the flat iron gaze, the dead silence, and the heavy brass bead of the Winchester broke his nerve entirely. His jaw clenched hard, his teeth grinding audibly. His right shoulder dropped in a sudden jerky spasm. His hand clawed downward, fingers scrambling blindly for the smooth, worn wooden grip of his tied-down Colt revolver. The stiff leather of his holster groaned a loud, fatal complaint into the freezing air. Silas did not shift his stance. He did not issue a final warning. He simply squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared. The sound was not a mere noise. It was a physical entity, a deafening concussive crack of rapidly expanding gases that ruptured the fragile morning stillness and slammed violently against the eardrums. A 3-foot tongue of angry orange fire spewed outward from the octagonal barrel, cutting fiercely through the dissipating white vapor of the horse's breath. The heavy .44-40 slug crossed the 10 yards of frost-heaved gravel in a fraction of a heartbeat. It struck the young rider dead center in his chest, an inch below his collarbone. The sheer kinetic force of the heavy lead stopped his downward motion instantly. It lifted him entirely out of the saddle, tearing his worn boots free from the heavy iron stirrups. He hit the frozen, unyielding earth backward with a sickening, heavy thud. His unfired Colt spun uselessly out of his grip, clattering away into the dirt. He did not move again. Chaos erupted, immediate and absolute. The massive man on the right released a raw, guttural roar from deep within his chest. He hauled the heavy double-barreled shotgun upward, throwing the wooden stock against his massive shoulder. Silas dropped. He let his knees buckle, sacrificing his height as he fell toward the porch floorboards. In the same fluid, violent motion, his right hand cranked the lever of the Winchester. Clack, clack. A smoking, blackened brass casing spun upward through the freezing air, striking the wooden awning with a sharp ping before tumbling into the dust. The fresh round seated perfectly into the chamber. The shotgun detonated. Both barrels fired simultaneously in a booming, ungodly roar that dwarfed the rifle shot. A massive wall of heavy lead buckshot tore completely through the space Silas had occupied only a split second before. The thick wooden support pillar of the porch awning took the brunt of the blast. It disintegrated instantly. Long, jagged splinters of dry, petrified pine exploded outward like deadly shrapnel. A heavy chunk of jagged wood drove hard into Silas's left shoulder. It tore cleanly through the thick canvas of the duster, pierced the ash-colored shirt beneath, and buried itself deep into the dense muscle. The pain registered as a hot, blinding white flash that traveled instantly down to his fingertips. Silas ground his back teeth together, swallowing a sharp, involuntary grunt. He hit the floorboards hard on his right knee, ignoring the burning trench in his shoulder. He brought the Winchester up, leveling the barrel centering the front sight directly on the massive, formless bulk of the man in the buffalo coat. The big man was frantically breaking open the smoking breech of his shotgun, his thick, leather-gloved fingers fumbling clumsily with 2 fresh brass shells pulled from his coat pocket. Silas fired. The rifle kicked back hard, the butt plate slamming against his uninjured shoulder. The heavy buffalo coat jerked violently backward. The round buried itself deep into the man's throat, destroying the windpipe instantly. Blood sprayed outward in a thick, dark, crimson mist, instantly catching the pale sunlight, before vaporizing in the freezing air. The man dropped the shotgun. He crumpled sideways, his heavy body slipping awkwardly off his terrified dancing mount. He crashed heavily against the frozen wooden edge of the water trough, shattering the thin layer of surface ice before sliding down into the dirt. 2 down. The yard was a swirling maelstrom of panicking horses kicking dust and choking white gun smoke. The scarred man on the black gelding had not frozen. At the exact moment the young rider fell, he had spurred his horse violently to the right, using the rearing, terrified animals as a moving barricade between himself and the porch. He drew a long-barreled Remington revolver from his coat, his pale eyes entirely stripped of their previous calm, replaced by a cold, murderous focus. Gunfire answered gunfire. The scarred man fired twice in rapid, booming succession. The first bullet shattered the heavy window frame 2 feet to Silas's left, raining a shower of jagged, glittering shards of glass over his heavy boots. The second round found its mark. It tore through the lower edge of Silas's canvas duster, biting a deep, burning trench directly into his left flank, just above the crest of his hip bone. The impact spun Silas half a turn. His right leg gave out, and he hit the wooden floorboards flat on his back. His breath left his lungs in a sharp, involuntary hiss. The metallic, bitter taste of adrenaline flooded the back of his throat, mingling with the heavy scent of sulfur. He could feel the sudden wet warmth of his own blood spreading rapidly against his side, soaking into the fabric of his shirt. The scarred man kicked his gelding fiercely in the ribs, breaking clear of the dust and the panicking loose horses. He reined the animal in, hard leveling the smoking Remington downward at the prone figure on the porch. He narrowed his pale eyes, his thumb pulling back the heavy hammer for a final finishing execution shot. Silas did not attempt to scramble to his feet. He did not desperately seek the meager cover of the shattered porch pillar. Lying awkwardly on his side, his left arm completely useless and throbbing with a dull, sickening heat, he rolled slightly. He braced the heavy octagonal barrel of the Winchester entirely across his bent right knee. He did not look at the scarred, triumphant face of the man looming above him. He looked only at the small brass bead of the front sight, perfectly aligning it with the center mass of the gray duster. He stopped breathing. The chaotic world around him, the screaming horses, the biting wind, the burning pain in his flank, shrunk down until it existed only in the microscopic space between his trigger finger and the metal sear. He squeezed. The rifle bucked violently against his knee. The sharp, booming crack swallowed the sound of the galloping hooves. The scarred man jolted violently in the saddle as if struck by an invisible, massive hammer. The Remington fired a wild, useless shot straight up into the porch roof as his arm jerked involuntarily skyward. A small, dark, perfectly round hole appeared dead center in his chest, punched cleanly through the heavy canvas of his coat. He sat completely rigid for 2 full seconds. The gelding continued its forward momentum, carrying the dead weight across the yard. Then the man's spine lost its structural integrity. He slumped heavily forward, his face burying itself deep into the gelding's coarse, sweat-soaked black mane. His fingers slowly uncurled from the leather reins. He slid lazily down the side of the animal, hitting the frost-covered gravel with a dull thud. He rolled twice before coming to a dead, unmoving stop beside the broken water trough. The black gelding trotted a few more yards toward the open gate, snorted loudly, and stopped. It lowered its heavy head, its sides heaving rapidly. The other 2 horses were already bolting wildly toward the open desert, their empty leather stirrups slapping violently against their flanks, kicking up a fresh trail of white dust. The gunfire ceased. The deafening noise vanished, leaving behind a profound, ringing emptiness. The silence rushed back in, but it was fundamentally altered. The freezing air was heavy and thick with the acrid, sulphurous stench of burned black powder. A dense gray cloud of gun smoke drifted lazily across the shattered porch, stinging the eyes and coating the back of the throat with a harsh, metallic bite. The ringing in Silas's ears was a high, continuous, piercing whine, completely drowning out the low moan of the cold desert wind. He remained perfectly still on the splintered floorboards. The biting cold of the morning seeped upward through the wood, directly into his bones. He lay there, his breathing slow and shallow, listening to the erratic, rhythmic dripping of the dead man's blood, hitting the frost near the trough. The violent storm had passed exactly as it had arrived, brutal, sudden, and devastating, leaving behind only a shattered, bloody quiet. The ringing in Silas's skull thinned out. It receded like a dying tide, replaced slowly by the low, hollow moaning of the basin wind cutting through the shattered porch pillar. The air hung thick, a heavy metallic soup of burned sulfur-scorched wood and the raw, heavy scent of fresh blood. Frost clung stubbornly to the dead men in the yard, undisturbed by the violence. Silas placed his right hand flat against the splintered floorboards. He pushed. His left arm hung completely slack at his side, a dead weight anchored by a burning, jagged spike of agony buried deep in his shoulder. His breathing was a harsh, wet rasp. He gained his feet. The horizon tilted on a violent, sickening axis for a fraction of a second, then snapped back into a rigid, painful clarity. He did not step off the porch to check the bodies. Dead men did not require inspection, and the black gelding cropping dry grass near the water trough told him everything he needed to know. He turned and crossed the threshold. His boot heels crushed the glittering teeth of the shattered window glass, grinding the shards deep into the worn wood grain with a heavy, scraping crunch. He dropped the Winchester onto the oak table. It landed with a solid, resonant thud. He gripped the heavy canvas of his duster with his right hand and pulled it roughly off his ruined left shoulder. The fabric tore away with a wet, peeling sound, pulling a thick crust of drying blood with it. He looked down. A jagged 6-inch splinter of petrified porch pine protruded squarely from the dense muscle beneath his collarbone. The wood stained a deep, saturated crimson. He did not hesitate. He clamped his right hand completely around the rough, bloody wood. He locked his jaw, grinding his back molars until they ached in his skull, and ripped the splinter free in one violent, continuous upward motion. Dark blood rushed instantly to fill the void. It spilled hot and fast down his chest, soaking into the ash-colored cotton of his shirt. He walked to the shelf and grabbed a half-empty bottle of raw rye whiskey. He pulled the cork with his teeth, spatted onto the floorboards, and poured the amber liquid directly into the open, weeping cavity. The torn flesh hissed. The muscle involuntarily seized a blinding white flare of pure heat that forced a low, feral growl through his clenched teeth. He tore a long, broad strip of clean cotton from a flour sack resting on the counter. He bound the shoulder tight, wrapping the fabric under his armpit and pulling the knot fiercely tight with his right hand and his teeth. He ignored the burning, shallow trench carved across his hip. It was a simple flesh crease bleeding sluggishly, already beginning to clot in the freezing air of the cabin. He walked back to the center of the room. He kicked the heavy Navajo rug aside, revealing the iron ring. He hooked his thumb through the metal and pulled the heavy oak trap door upward. The rusty hinges shrieked a loud, agonizing complaint that echoed off the low ceiling. The damp, earthy odor of the root cellar drifted up, a blend of wet clay, dry rot, and old potatoes mingling immediately with the sharp, overwhelming stench of copper and rye whiskey radiating from his skin. The pitch-black square remained completely silent. Silas knelt heavily on his good right knee. He let his bandaged left arm rest against his thigh. He reached his uninjured right hand down into the dark abyss. "Clear," he stated. His voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp, barely carrying over the wind outside. A small, hesitant shuffle echoed from the packed dirt below. The girl materialized first, ascending the rough stairs. Her hands clamped onto the edge of the floorboards. She hauled herself up into the pale light. Her eyes were wide, feral, tracking the fresh, bright blood soaking the left side of Silas's chest, watching the heavy, dark droplets pooling on the wood beside his knee. She did not speak. She turned back immediately and reached down into the hole. She hauled her brother up. The boy was shivering violently. His fever had broken in the damp, freezing cold of the cellar, leaving him entirely drained, his skin a pale, translucent white slick with old sweat. He stumbled clumsily as his worn boots hit the floorboards, his knees buckling outward. He fell forward. He didn't hit the wood. Silas caught him. Silas's massive, blood-soaked right hand clamped firmly around the boy's thin bicep, arresting his fall with an absolute, unyielding grip. The boy looked up. He stared directly at the dark, wet, crimson coating the calloused knuckles holding him upright. He stared at the thick, jagged splinter of bone-white wood resting in a pool of blood on the floorboards nearby. He did not pull away. He did not shrink back. Slowly, the boy reached out with his own small, dirt-caked hand. He wrapped his trembling fingers entirely around Silas's massive, bloody wrist. The grip was impossibly weak, fragile as a hollow bird's bone, but it held tight. It was a desperate anchor dropped in the center of a violent storm. Silas looked down at the small hand. He looked up at the girl. Her gaze was locked onto the shattered window frame. Through the jagged perimeter of broken glass, the 3 dead men lay frozen in the dirt. 3 empty saddles. The broken circle outfit did not absorb losses. They compounded them. The iron rule of the basin dictated that spilled blood always demanded a heavier, more brutal measure of blood in return. Riderless horses would eventually find their way back to the ranch. When they did, a dozen men heavily armed with Winchesters and rope would ride north. This cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a wooden coffin waiting for the lid to be nailed firmly shut. Silas gently unpried the boy's fingers from his wrist. He stood up, his massive frame casting a long, dark, unmovable shadow over the two exhausted children. "Gather your coats." Silas rumbled, his voice completely devoid of any inflection. "We ride." Silas moved toward the rear of the cabin, his boots dragging slightly in the frost-coated dirt. The bleeding had slowed, but a dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder radiated down to his fingertips with every movement. Behind the stacked cordwood sat a narrow, sun-warped buckboard wagon. He threw his right arm over the heavy canvas tarp covering the bed and hauled it back. The stiff material cracked loudly in the cold air. The girl materialized beside the wagon tongue. She did not ask questions. She picked up a heavy oiled leather harness from a wooden peg. Her narrow shoulders strained under the dead weight, but she dragged it steadily toward the corral. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He led his own thick-necked draft horse out from the lean-to. Together, in absolute heavy silence, they worked the cold brass buckles and stiff leather straps. Silas used his teeth and his good right hand to cinch the heavy belly band tight. The girl led the dead man's black gelding over, slipping the forged iron bit past its teeth with efficient mechanical precision. They hitched both animals to the heavy oak doubletree. The wood groaned under the sudden tension. Inside the cabin, the air was already growing stale. The girl gathered a burlap sack of dry pinto beans, the half-eaten loaf of hard sourdough, and the heavy iron skillet. She carried them out to the wagon bed, arranging them securely next to a heavy wooden crate of Winchester ammunition. She helped her brother up over the lowered tailgate. The boy curled instantly into a tight, shivering ball on the bare wooden planks. She covered him completely with a heavy, moth-eaten buffalo hide, leaving only a small, dark gap near his face for the freezing air. Silas remained standing in the doorway of the cabin. He held a heavy, galvanized metal tin in his right hand. He unscrewed the rusted brass cap. The sharp chemical bite of raw kerosene instantly overpowered the lingering heavy scent of stale coffee and fresh blood. He walked to the far corner of the room. He tipped the tin. The clear liquid splashed heavily against the dry, porous pine logs. He walked backward, laying a continuous wet trail across the floorboards, over the faded Navajo rug, and across the scarred surface of the oak table. He poured the remaining liquid directly onto the splintered threshold. He set the empty tin down on the porch. He pulled a thin white paper from his coat pocket, pinched a measure of dry tobacco, and rolled it one-handed against his thigh. He struck a match against the doorframe. He lit the cigarette, pulling the harsh smoke deep into his lungs. He looked at the burning yellow cherry for a fraction of a second, then flicked the still-burning match over his shoulder. The ignition was a physical blow. A dull, concussive whoomp sucked the oxygen from the immediate area. A solid sheet of bright, unnatural orange flame raced across the soaked floorboards, climbing the walls with a ravenous, crackling roar. The heat pushed outward in a heavy, suffocating wave, immediately melting the frost clinging to the porch railing. The cabin, a silent wooden witness to a decade of absolute isolation and a morning of butchery, began to rapidly disintegrate into ash. Silas walked to the buckboard. He climbed up onto the driver's bench. His left arm remained firmly pinned against his ribs, completely useless. The wooden seat creaked loudly beneath his immense weight. The girl climbed up the iron wheel, spokes her worn boots scraping against the metal. She sat rigidly beside him on the hard wood. She did not turn her head to watch the fire. She stared straight out over the heavy rhythmic tossing of the horses' heads. Her good eye fixed firmly on the jagged line of the western horizon. Behind them, the dry cedar roof shingles began to violently pop and shatter in the inferno. A thick, oily column of dense black smoke rose straight up into the pale, windless sky, a towering marker visible for 50 miles in any direction. It was an undeniable signal to the Broken Circle outfit. It was the absolute end to the life Silas had carved out of the dirt. Silas transferred his cigarette to the corner of his mouth. He gathered the thick leather driving lines into his right hand, wrapping them securely around his calloused knuckles. The vast, empty expanse of the basin stretched out before them, an ocean of bleached scrub and cracked earth, offering nothing but punishing miles and brutal exposure. There was no destination spoken. There was no comforting hand placed on a trembling shoulder. He gave the leather lines a single sharp snap against the horses' rumps. The animals leaned hard into their collars. The heavy leather traces snapped taut. The iron-rimmed wheels groaned, fighting the dead inertia, and then began to slowly turn. Crunch. Crunch. The iron ground heavily against the frozen stones of the yard. The wagon rolled past the broken water trough, past the 3 freezing corpses, and passed through the open wooden gate. The rhythmic mechanical sound of the turning wheels and the heavy synchronized thumping of hooves filled the cold morning air, carrying them away from the smoke, driving them relentlessly toward the unforgiving edge of the frontier. The smoke from the burning cabin will eventually fade, but the weight of what happened in the frozen dirt never truly washes away. Silas traded his quiet exile for the heavy, unpredictable burden of 2 broken lives. He chose sudden, absolute violence, not out of malice, but because out here, the desert offers no mercy to the weak. You have been listening to Iron Resolve Tales. We tell the stories of those who walk the jagged, unforgiving edges of survival. And it leaves a heavy question lingering in the cold wind, one we want you to answer down in the comments. When a man uses unapologetic, brutal ruthlessness to shield the innocent, does that make him a monster? Or is that the only pure form of justice left in a lawless land? Where exactly do you draw the line? Share your thoughts below. If this journey resonated with you, take a quiet second to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more trails to ride and many more shadows waiting to be uncovered. Keep your powder dry. We will see you further down the road.